Dogman wandered into town. An extra long Dogman special featuring 6 allegedly true Dogman and werewolf stories. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had a really creepy encounter with a completely freaky Dogman, or upright walking canine or something of that nature, when I was late making a delivery in upstate New York, right on the border with New Jersey. I don't want to say the name of the company I was making this delivery for, because they're still friends with my parents and I don't want any more bad blood. I got fired for this delivery, not because of the Dogman encounter, but because I had this habit of getting lost while making deliveries, and this one was just the one that finally got my boss angry enough at me that I was canned. Look, I tried, but I was a terrible delivery driver type guy. I don't blame him for firing me, but he did it in such a harsh way that now I'm almost as scared of him as I am of the Dogman. It doesn't matter what I was delivering anyway. It just matters that I was confused and lost and late, and that it was starting to get dark out. Since this was the early spring, it was sort of nice and flowery in some places, but still wintry looking in other places, with barren tree branches not yet budding. It looked scenic one second and Halloweeny the next. I believe that when the incident happened, I was in Suffern, New York, but I do not remember which street. There was one right on the edge of the settlement, though, because I remember looking past the houses and seeing mountains off in the distance. I was right on the very edge of civilization, and there was nothing but hills, and plants, and animals, and monsters, from that point on for miles and miles and miles. A voice in my head was telling me that I better get out of there, but when I looked around, all I saw were fine homes with well-off families. Nothing spooky there at all. And then, suddenly, there was the spookiest thing of all to see. Walking right down this road, by these nice homes, was a dog-headed werewolf, or wolfman, or dogman, or whatever you would like to call it. This was the late 1980s, and so I called it a wolfman, and I assumed at first that it must be a rich kid in a costume. It wasn't Halloween, though, and there wasn't much cosplay back in those times, especially not in the middle of a nice suburban town. This also wasn't the kind of place you usually run into crazy people either. I couldn't understand why that person looked so much like an animal. And then, it walked directly in front of my headlights, forcing me to come to a full stop. And I'm telling you, that thing was real and alive. I can't tell you what it was a real and alive example of, but it wasn't a guy in a costume. I can't say it was too large to have been a man in a costume, but that would have had to have been a very tall fellow. It wasn't a costume, though. I saw too many cuts and bruises and missing patches of fur with skin discolorations for that to have been any sort of costume or makeup effects creation. Remember, I had it in the delivery truck's headlights while we both came to a full stop. It was not a costume. It was an unclothed, fur-covered, upright bipedal animal, but not the kind of animal that would be listed as officially existing. This was one of those kinds of animals from the other realm, the kind that walks out of fog and myth and mist and legend and memory and dreams. But it's not supposed to be walking down a suburban street like a Steven Spielberg nightmare. Now at first, this big dog just sort of squinted in the bright light and stood there. I've heard stories on your channel about them charging cars, and I think I would have fainted on the spot if he did that. But this one just sort of stood there and looked at me. I, in return, sat there and looked back. The thing did have eyeshine, but it wasn't any kind of supernatural sort of thing. I guess it stood a little under 7 feet tall while fully upright like that, and it was mainly colored a dark gray, but there were lighter spots on the lower legs. It stood on these thin-looking dog legs. I couldn't believe they could carry all his obvious weight. It didn't look as though it were having any difficulty, however. He seemed to look perfectly natural standing up like that. I do not recall seeing any clawed hands as are described in so many modern sightings, but then again, I was not really looking for that. This was so long ago, I wouldn't have known what to keep my eye out for. So when I tell this story lately, people lecture me about what I should have done, and what I could have done, and what an opportunity I had which I wasted, and so forth. None of what they say takes into account the fact that I was late making a delivery. They say, well, you got fired anyway. You should have prioritized the Dogman. I remind them, I had never heard of the Dogman in the first place. I had heard of my job, though. So at any rate, what I did was I beeped. I beeped at the monster in the road. That only seemed to confuse him further, and he continued to squint at me. It did draw the attention of the nearby homeowners and their families, however, none of whom seemed to blame me for what I was doing. When the Dogman noticed that he was being surrounded by nice rich families, he got freaked out and ran back the way he came. He dropped to all fours in mid-run and darted, lightning fast, between two houses, and off toward the vast forested hills and valleys beyond. I didn't really have time to watch him run off, though, because I wanted to take the opportunity to ask one of the neighbors out on the street for directions to the house that I still needed to deliver to. I think about that sighting a lot. One time, about 5 years afterward, I thought about camping out in one of the big parks located just past that town. My girlfriend and I had run into some extra money, and it almost happened, but then the electric bill arrived and life just moved onward and downward as usual. And so that was the time I saw a Dogman, long before I had the vaguest idea what a Dogman was. It was an upstate New York Dogman, one of the less reported kinds, and I take pride in that. I suppose that's all I can really still remember about the time that Dogman wandered into town. Our EP's Gilbert, first name Fred. He's obviously well-bred. Please join us in thanking the grand and glorious Fred Gilbert for making this episode possible. In exchange, Fred gets special perks from us, and so can you. International TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman will be along at the very end of this extra-long program to fill in all the deets about how you too can become a channel member and help us stay afloat. But now, here's story 2 of 6 in today's feature-length special, and we call this next nasty narrative Dogman Under the Streets. Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am a perfectly ordinary, boring sort of a person who has been bothered by a running problem in my life. Wherever I move, there seem to be Dogman infestations nearby. I've become convinced that these creatures move about through our sewer systems, and I wonder how the powers that be could possibly remain unaware of this situation. I'm not going to allege any kind of conspiracy here, but I often wonder how Dogman is kept officially mythical at this late stage of the game. Again, this is only my opinion. I realize there is a move on to criminalize opinion, but this is mine for as long as I'm allowed to have it. Heck, that'll be my opinion even if it does get outlawed. It's a hill I'm willing to die on. But of course, I'm not going to insist that it's provable fact, since I can't yet prove it, and I don't want to get your channel in trouble. Part of the reason I feel so strongly about this is that my Dogman experiences go back deep into my childhood. I don't know if I was even 10 yet when I saw the Dogman for the first time. He was staring, with his golden eyes, out of the sewer on our corner in Scotch Plains, New Jersey, which I would like to note is not far from the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. His head was a good 5 or 6 feet down from street level, and he made no threatening moves toward me as I leaned in closer to get a better look. But he was most definitely alive and conscious. Once I got back home, I tried to tell my mother, but my brother will call Ken, who was and is 9 years my senior, interrupted my story to tell my mother that I was lying and that I had gotten the idea from a Stephen King book. He meant It, which was I guess maybe 2 or 3 years old when this happened in the very late 1980s. First of all, I was 8 or 9 years old, and I was most definitely not allowed to read books about clowns who do terrible things to people my age. Ken argued that I must have heard about it from somebody, but honestly, I was being informed about that book for the first time by Ken. There was a TV movie with Tim Curry as the clown, but that didn't come out till November 1990, which would have been, I think, over a year after my Dogman sewer sighting. I told my mom that I wasn't talking about a clown anyway. I was talking about a big, hairy man with a wolf's head. Of course, hearing those words come from a boy the age I was back then did not carry very much gravitas, and my mother kicked me and my brother both out into the backyard so she could get back to her TV game shows. I took Ken down to the corner and I showed him what I was talking about. When my brother bent over and looked into that sewer, he told me later the thing with glowing eyes showed him his very large teeth and growled at him. He could see it as plainly as I could. That means it was actually there. The next thing I knew, my big brave teenager brother was running home screaming like a little girl. He was telling my mother that there was a crazy criminal in a werewolf costume and he was hiding inside the sewer. In my brother's mind, some weird, violent, serial pervert had been inspired by the Stephen King book, always back to the Stephen King book, and the guy was hiding in the sewer system. As upset as I had been, my brother was twice as bad. My mother kept telling him to calm down, but he just got more and more wound up about the subject. When he started insisting that he and Mom needed to call the cops together about the werewolf problem in the sewer, my mother got real serious. She started speaking quietly, which she only did when she was super angry. When Mom got like that, you needed to be absolutely quiet just to hear what she was saying. And if you didn't hear what she was saying, then you were going to be in even worse trouble. We got super quiet, and we heard our mother inform us that if we embarrassed her by telling the police that we have a werewolf in our sewer, she was going to take our brand new Sega Genesis, and she was going to throw it into that same sewer for the Wolfman to use instead of us. She knew she didn't need to say any more. The conversation was over, and we never talked to her about the werewolf in the sewer ever again. We only talked about it to our friends from then on. Neither Ken nor I saw that particular Dogman again, but we felt certain that he was there somewhere, under our feet, probably surviving off the rats and the alligators. So my next time seeing a Dogman was when I was driving in Michigan. Oh, I should say that before getting into the car that day, I was telling the other passenger about my Dogman experience in the sewer when I was young. This person was a classmate of mine in college that I will call Zing for personal reasons. Zing had been telling me about the Michigan Dogman as he was a native of the area and familiar with some local legends. I told him about my sighting in the sewers of New Jersey, and he agreed. It did sound as though I may have seen a Dogman far closer to the East Coast than Zing had known the creatures would ever go. That was when I told him my theory about them using sewer systems and other underground tunnels or cave systems to migrate around without being seen by us humans. If someone were to make a movie about my life, I'd give them permission to have that conversation occur in the car just before our sighting, instead of 20 minutes or however long before. When the sighting happened, we were talking about something else entirely. I don't even remember what, but we had been discussing the Dogman just as our journey that night began. So it was pretty astounding to both of us when an actual upright bipedal canine walked out of those woods onto the highway and into our hearts. More like into our heart attacks, as our first thought was not, "My, what an astounding synchronicity." Our first thought was something more like, "Oh my god, that's a 7-foot tall hairy monster running toward us." Here's how it went down, to the best of my memory. I was driving the car, even though it belonged to Zing's parents. He was so nervous about smashing up their huge, gas-guzzling, ancient Buick that he actually felt more secure allowing other students to drive the old heap. I can't remember where we were driving to, but we were on Market Avenue over by the Grand River and the recycling plants when an upright hairy man, with a head like a wolf, just walked out onto the road like he was starring in a 1950s monster picture, and it was time for his close-up. I mean that literally. He held his clawed hands or paws out in front of him as he walked on his hind legs, which looked canine, not human or anthropoid. He was sort of bent over forward a little bit as he walked, as though he were in a rush of some sort. When I saw him, I hit the brakes. I think the screeching sound of the car coming to an abrupt stop is what woke him up to the fact that he was walking out into traffic. In fairness, the only traffic was me and Zing, but the dog-headed ape man had nearly caused a very bad accident. But once he noticed us, the dog man flipped out. He never jumped onto our hood or tried to get in the car or any of the kinds of things I hear you talk about in other car encounter stories, but it kind of barked at us and it growled. I felt as though he were scolding the car, and sometimes me and Zing too. Like he would do this very canine thing of looking at you for a second, then looking away to the side or upward and howling. He had this sort of worried look on his face, and he paced back and forth in front of us, raging on like Ralph Cramden having a huge blowout with his wife Alice. The scarier the dog tried to sound, and the bigger a display he put on, the more I became aware that he was just as scared as we were. He had been startled by the presence of our car, and now he was growling and acting hostile toward us in order to save face, more or less. I felt strongly that if we just let him blow off his steam, he'd leave us alone. I got this sense that everything was gonna be all right. I tried to turn to tell all this to Zing, but when I tried to speak, I found I was so frightened that I couldn't make the correct noises come out of my mouth. Forget Zing, I remember thinking. Let him figure it out for himself. After some length, the dogman seemed to have barked and whined so much that he was making his voice as hoarse as mine. At that point, he exited to our right, walking into some trees, and apparently jumping into the Grand River, judging by the big splash we heard coming from over there. Then again, it might have been some random person jumping into the water to get away from that big mean dogman. Oh, this is as good a place as any to insert the random fact that this all happened really close to the Hopewell Indian Mounds Park, which is located just a ways down that same river. I don't know if that really has anything to do with this story at all, but if a cryptid sighting is near an ancient religious site, I think this information should be noted. So, anyway, when the dogman finished shouting and marched off, I robotically put the car back in gear, and we drove off silently. After a few minutes, I heard Zing softly weeping, but I was still too much in shock to say anything soothing, or even to look at him. When we got to wherever we were going, I remember Zing asking me how I did that. I asked him what had I done. He said, not only had I made a dogman appear in front of us, but I had it walk out of the recycling area. I still wasn't catching his point. Your childhood sighting was in a sewer, he reminded me. Sewers are underground tunnels leading to waste treatment plants. And we both saw the dogman walk out of a waste treatment plant, I realized with amazement. I remember I was like, wow, how did I manage to pull that off? Now, I have not personally seen any more dogmen since then, but my neighbor here in Saginaw, Michigan has. I know what you're saying. If you don't like dogman, don't live in Michigan. But I saw the dogman in New Jersey, so I don't think I could escape him if I tried. At any rate, we live on the southern edge of town near the Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge. I keep trying to get my neighbor to set up trap cameras, but he refuses, saying they scare the Dogman away. I have 2 cameras on my property, and he says that's why I never see the creatures any longer. At least I know that if one visits here, I'll get some evidence of it, which is something he can't say. As frightening as the Dogman are, or I should say as frightening as encounters with the Dogman are, I still prefer to see them above ground, where I can tell what they're doing. For me personally, there's something so incredibly creepy and disconcerting about the idea of Dogman under the streets, Dogman under our feet. We think Michelle is swell. For Michelle Rich, we would never switch. Please join us in thanking today's executive producer, Michelle Rich, for making this episode possible. In exchange, Michelle receives secret, uncensored Dogman episodes. International TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman will be along at the very end of this extra-long program to fill in all the details about how you too can become a channel member and help us stay alive. But now, here's story 3 out of 6 in today's extra-long Dogman special, and we call this next allegedly true scary story, Dogman Moves In When We Move Out. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I can't believe that I'm writing to a YouTube channel about a monster that I saw, but then again, this is 2022, and nothing should surprise me. If you asked me 10 years ago what I'd be doing in 2022, I'd have told you I'd be managing my father's business, just as he had always told me I would be doing. But something happened to the world to change it. And so instead of running my father's business, the building he owned is abandoned by everyone, except for the Dogman. My brother, who now calls himself my half-brother, used to be my closest friend, or so I thought. I was adopted into the family, and I thought I was being treated as a full equal. Certainly, they always assured me they loved me and would treat me and consider me as a full-blooded family member. I remember my father, or really my adopted father, taking me to the factory where the product he manufactured was created. We all owed our lives to that product which my father invented and patented. I won't name the product, but it provided great service and relief to people. It made the world a little better of a place, and I was always quite proud of my father for creating it. He seemed so happy to have made the world better, and I was proud to carry on his family name. I'm not going to blame his son or his son's generation for what happened since, because in the last few years of his life, my father changed, same as the rest of his entire social class it seemed. Back in late 2016 or early 2017, something hardened my family and all their friends. I found myself being left out of conversations. It was clear that I was no longer considered a full member of the family, and I began to be treated as a poor relation. When my father, or rather my adopted father, finally passed on, I was stunned to find out that I was not going to be placed in charge of the factory as I had been promised for as long as I could remember. Instead, the factory was just one of many businesses and sub-businesses that Dad left to his biological son. By the time of the reading of the will, that factory had already been shut down. The business sold to interests in China. They moved the manufacturing overseas, which utterly killed the town Dad had built the factory in. Again, I don't want to make my half-brother seem evil or cruel, as these plans were already underway when Dad was alive. It's just that I didn't know about any of this, because I had been cut out of the loop without anyone ever explaining what had changed. I was left with a small monthly stipend, not enough to live on, and an opportunity to purchase a guest home on the family property at a reduced rate that was still out of my current range. I had to get a job, Laugh if you will, but a friend of mine literally taught me to code. So, I'm fine, I'm not gonna starve or become homeless. But it's clear that my family is not really my family any longer. I try to bother them as little as I can, as I know that my presence is no longer appreciated. I'm mostly okay with all of this, especially in these times where so many others are suffering so much more than I could ever imagine. Sometimes I get sad though. I get nostalgic for the family I once thought loved me. And one time, I even drove over to see the old factory that had been promised for years would be mine to manage. Well, I'm not going to tell you where this is, partially because if you knew the location, you'd also be able to figure out who my family are. But this town was devastated. The factory had only been shut down for 14 months maybe, but the entire area had gone desolate, and the building itself was in such a state of disrepair, you'd have thought it had been sitting abandoned for a generation. I wondered how so many of the windows got broken in that 1 year, especially with the town seeming so empty. Maybe they bust in vagrants to break things and write graffiti everywhere. Seriously, it looked like the town had been a war zone that eventually was abandoned. There was no sign of life anywhere within sight, other than vegetation. Foolishly, I climbed inside the dilapidated old factory building through a broken window, and inside things were even more wrecked. I got the impression that people were very angry when the factory closed, and much of the destruction inside there must have been a manifestation of that anger and frustration. I imagine how many people it must have taken to topple some of the abandoned machinery. These people had put as much great effort into destroying this place as they had once put into making the product my father invented. My adopted father, I mean. My family no longer want me considering them my family, only my adopted family. If that weren't the case, this factory would still be in operation. I'd be running it, and all the people that tore this place to shreds in fury would still be employed, working here, still buying groceries at the store in town that was now closed, still filling the streets, which were now empty. This had been a place of life, and it was going to be the home of my future. Now it was a place of the past and of death. And what better home could there be for the North American upright walking canine, or dogman? I know that might seem like a non sequitur, but so did the appearance of the dogman in my life. I was thinking about leaving the factory and going home when some movement caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. Glancing up to the second level of the interior, I saw what I at first thought was a fully grown black bear rising up onto its hind legs up near the top of the staircase leading down to my level. I screamed in shock. Not like a scream queen in the movies. I just mean a short exclamation of surprise. I'd like to think I shouted in a manly way, but I probably screeched like a small child in utter fear because believe me, when I saw that giant, hairy beast approaching the top of the staircase, I was completely gripped by abject fear. I mean, crushing fear. Devastating fear. The fear you get when you think you might be about to be torn apart alive. This creature proceeded to walk like a man up to the top of the metallic staircase leading down to me, and I was able to look up there and witness his entire form in one view. Well, let me tell you, I was not looking at a bear. First of all, I think even more important than its appearance was its attitude. This guy did not walk like you or me, really. He walked like my family. I mean, my former family, my adopted family. He walked like he was important. And when he looked down to my level, he looked like royalty, observing his domain. He acted like the owner, and he acted like the boss. So many Dogman stories describe his teeth or his claws, but so few make note of what's really terrifying about this creature. The way he seems to naturally run the show. He's the owner. He's the boss. He's the straw that stirs the drink. When Dogman enters a story, he decides what happens next. This might have started off as a story I was telling about myself, but once the Dogman strolled in, I'm telling a story about him, see? To me, that's the most important thing I can tell you about the Dogman. This is his world, and we're just characters in his story. So, yeah, I'm calling him Dogman, but I never even told you what he looked like, other than that he had black fur. So do black bears. So why am I so sure I wasn't just looking at a big old black bear that I woke up from hibernation? Well, black bears don't have hands, for one thing. This guy was standing at the very top of the metal steps, and he was holding on to the top of the metal banister. Holding on as in gripping it with his fingers and his thumb. Yes, he had a thumb. Bears have very long, very dangerous claws, and this guy did too. But bears do not have thumbs. Bears can't grip the handrail while descending a staircase. I know what you're saying. You encountered a Dogman and all you want to talk about is his thumbs, but yes, I saw that he had thumbs, and I knew I was not in Kansas any longer. If you have never heard the sound of a 7-foot-tall, 800-pound behemoth running down a metal staircase, shaking the entire second floor in the process, his dog nails clinking and clanking against the steps as he descends more rapidly than you would have thought possible, then consider yourself lucky. I did hear that sound, the sound which meant I had to run, and I discovered to my horror that my legs were locked, frozen in complete fear and shock. I had come there to feel sorry for myself and to experience painful family memories. I had not come there to run for my life from an impossible monster. Somehow, my legs began to work again, and I remember the race to the window I had come in. I literally dove through that window, but it didn't turn out as gracefully as when the stuntmen do things like that in the movies. I got banged up pretty badly getting through that window, but I did it. I remember running away, battered, and a bit bloodied, but able to look back and see that Dogman was staring out the window at me, hate in his eyes. I don't suppose you can ever go home again, can you? Or if you do, you should expect Dogman to be there, leaving his doggy-doo all over the floor. This is because life does not exist in a vacuum. Things continue to change day by day, minute by minute. Nothing is going to slow down and wait for you to catch up. And if you're going to abandon the important spaces in your life, don't expect them to still be there when you go looking for them. And that's because Dogman moves in when we move out. Our EP's great, and that's a yes. Our EP is just the best. Our EP is a success because our EP is the great CS. Please join us in thanking CS for making this episode possible. In exchange, we share with her lots of badass perks, like the upcoming 5-hour Volume 5 of our secret uncensored Dogman archive. And you too can get all these cool perks while helping our channel to stay alive. International TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman will be along at the very end of this extra long program to fill in all the deets about how you too can become a channel member and an executive producer and help keep us alive. But now, here's story 4 of 6, and I think you'll understand why we call this one St. Patrick's Day Dogman in the Wolf Road Woods. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I once saw a Dogman, but because it happened on the night of St. Patrick's Day, nobody believes that I really saw it. I think my sighting classifies as a classic cryptid encounter, but everyone else wants to file it under pink elephants. If you have trouble getting anyone to believe you about your Dogman or cryptid experiences, try telling them the incident took place on St. Patrick's Day, and you'll find that even some cryptid sympathetic people will roll their eyes at your narrative. My experience took place in a suburb of Chicago in Illinois. I know that you don't get too many Dogman stories from Illinois, but I bet that the creatures migrate through this state. In fact, I know they have to because of my sighting. It technically happened in a place called Willow Springs, Illinois. But if you look at that on a map, you'll notice that it's centrally located between Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin. And those places are known for Dogman sightings. Well, Michigan and Wisconsin at least. So it doesn't seem so strange to me that a predator known to live in those two states might sometimes stroll through the state in between them. Now, this past year and the year before it were strange ones. At least, I hope we never see their likes again. I lost so many people I thought were friends as they changed before my eyes into humorless, mean-spirited old people long before their years. It reached the point where the only people I wanted to spend St. Patrick's Day with were all either moved away or passed away. So I went a bit of bar hopping, not too much mind you, as not every bar would even allow me in due to some draconian new law which I expect to be repealed soon. Any law which prevents an Irishman from getting soused on this most holy of days is clearly an unjust law. That's not to say I did get drunk, because I didn't. I'm just saying I could have if I wanted to, because it was my God-given American right as an Irishman to do so. But I admit I did have a wee taste of heaven here and there as I visited these fine establishments. Now, somehow, I wandered out of the town proper to go wander in the greenery of nature. Of course, there wasn't really much green out there, since spring hadn't really kicked in yet. Plus, it was far colder than I had expected it to be. But still, I found myself walking down Wolf Road in the woods, not heading anywhere in particular, just to enjoy the night and my memories of back when we were all still allowed to laugh and joke around with each other. St. Patrick's is a night for free spirits, and it didn't seem a mere coincidence to me that I was spending this one alone. And then suddenly, I was no longer alone. A large, dark figure walked out of the woods, taking long, slow steps. He appeared to be dragging something behind him. I waved and said hello, and the figure stopped moving entirely, freezing into place, staring back at me. In a mellow and friendly mood, I continued to approach until I was close enough that I could make out the scene more clearly. That fellow was dragging a deer behind him, which meant he was much larger than I had at first figured. The deer wasn't moving, so I figured he must have been asleep. Maybe the large man was moving the deer to a more comfortable place to sleep. I didn't even know deer existed in the area. Maybe they aren't supposed to. Maybe this man was relocating the deer to a better habitat. That seemed a considerate thing to do, and I intended to say something to that effect to the man when he suddenly issued a sort of a shout in my direction that felt like a slap on the cheek a little bit. This person seemed inarticulate. Could they be insane or dangerous? I looked a little more closely, and the fellow had the strangest face I've ever seen. It really took me some time staring before I could even understand what I was looking at. I'm 99% sure that was not a human being. Possibly it may once have been, but when I was looking at it, most, if not all, of the humanity was absent. Possibly it was a werewolf because its head did look oddly canine, and it was entirely covered in thick dog fur, not wearing any clothing at all. I remember thinking that he should at least be wearing a green hat, considering what day it was, but then I banished the thought as frivolous. This shouting, angry-looking, dog-headed fellow was much larger than I was, and he seemed to be growing increasingly belligerent toward me. I heard a low growling. Then I realized I was the one the wolf-headed beast man was growling at. I think this was when I rubbed my bleary eyes and took a good long look at this guy. He was tall, taller than I am by a head and a half. His fur was a dark kind of reddish brown, and he had a lot of it everywhere. Well, not on the palms of his strange-looking hands. They looked like dog paw versions of human hands, but the backs were covered in fur, and the ends of each of the fingers had long, sharp claws protruding from them. Not too different from bear claws, or those of a kangaroo, I suppose. It also reminded me of a kangaroo or bear in the way it stood up on its hind legs the way it did. Those were not bear legs or kangaroo legs that it stood on, though. They looked more like the legs of Satan himself, I realized, and I began to shudder all over. Was I being visited by the devil himself? And on such a holy day? Whether that creature be the devil or just something evil, in either case, I had happened upon him by accident. Now that we were staring at each other, I realized I had to undo what I had done. I had to make it so that this never happened, or the closest thing to that. With this great beast staring at me, his wild eyes glowing in the darkness, I was going to have to be the one to back off. The Dogman was afraid to move, and he seemed even more afraid of me moving. I got the impression that he would prefer not to fight, but that he would be willing to. I was going to have to be the bigger of the two of us. I was going to have to give ground to him. I backed up a step, then another. I noticed the creature's eyes widening, then squinting down at me. I had to be careful not to act too submissive, or he might start to perceive me as potential prey. I needed him to see me as another carnivore or omnivore, but one willing to give him the right of way during this accidental encounter. I aimed to allow him a face-saving way to avoid actual physical fighting. Neither of us wanted a fight, so why did it seem so inevitable? That was a question I had asked myself a lot of times in the past 5 years or so, about nearly everyone I knew. Now it was becoming a matter of life or death. If I fought this particular opponent, I might not live to tell the tale. So I backed up another step, and then I waited to see what would happen. I still had the undivided attention of the huge dog beast, but he wasn't growling quite as loudly as he had been earlier. Oh man, I wanted to turn and run so badly. I wanted to scream like a little baby and run home to Mama. But my mother, God rest her soul, left us years earlier. There was nothing I could do except be a man about it. Either I would be able to back away, or this creature was going to painfully terminate my existence. If I wanted to live, I had to keep this slow and nerve-wracking process going. I had to just keep backing up, one step at a time. There was a moment where the dinosaur dog seemed to have finally understood my commitment to avoiding conflict, and he let out a long breath, almost like a sigh. I felt like laughing inside, but I knew this ordeal was not yet over. The immense wolfman turned away from me finally, and returned to dragging his heavy load, following the path he was on, into the woods to my left, and out of my sight. As for me, I turned and ran like a weeping child. You would have thought something terrible happened, the way I was uncontrollably bawling. It was an embarrassing, shameful display. I couldn't stop my eyes from tearing up, and so I just went home to be pathetic in private, where nobody had to know about it. So I went home, and I had a quick slug of Irish whiskey to steady my nerves and relax me enough that I could get to sleep. The next day, as you can imagine, nobody I knew believed my story. Nobody even wanted to hear it. And yet, I don't have a lying hair on my head, and this story is as true as my mother was sweet. So that's the way it went down. And for those of you who think I played it poorly, please tell me what you would have done if you found yourself confronted by St. Patrick's Dogman in the Wolf Road Woods. First of all, happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. And second of all, I'm gonna bust a rhyme. Blue Cruise is all the news. Hey, all of yous, please thank Blue Cruise. Yes, please thank Blue Cruise for making this episode possible. In exchange, we share with them secret, uncensored Dogman stories far too wild to run on this channel. Mangy TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman will be along at the very end of this extra-long program to fill in all the gory details about how you too can become a channel member and an executive producer. But now, here's story 5 of 6 in today's feature-length special, and we call this next one I Found and Lost Proof of Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am not particularly proud to mention this, but I worked for decades for a carnival barker and sideshow hustler who some of the older members of this audience may remember as a U.S. congressperson. He was a criminal, and even though he has passed on, I am not brave enough to mention his name. I am also not going to mention his state, as he and I would both immediately be recognized and outed. This story is going to have to remain anonymous, and that's because it features the North American upright walking canid, or Dogman. One of my many ongoing jobs for my former boss, who we can just call the boss man, was to scout out properties that might become more valuable if redeveloped. Sometimes we'd figure out some sweet scams where we could buy up useless property dirt cheap, then rezone the area as commercial and find that you're sitting on top of a gold mine. It was like a certain Speaker of the House who would pass laws to benefit her stock portfolio. What was her name again? Can't quite remember. So, the boss man was a crook, and I was a crook's assistant. The main differences between us is that he took all the profits, and I suffered all the guilt for what we were both doing. A society can't remain free if it's sold down the river by hacks and crooks, and we were those hacks and crooks undermining human society itself. Laugh at me for being dramatic, but when your grandchildren are begging oligarchs for scraps of bread, you'll be able to lay the blame at the feet of me and the boss man and other crooks of this generation who cared only about themselves and not at all about the future. Excuse me, other distinguished elected officials, that's what I meant to say. It's just that each time I try to say politician, my mouth forms the word criminal. So one day I was scouting out an area of town that had been devastated by the boss man's predecessor's rezoning. It was now almost completely uninhabited and ripe for rezoning again. We were probably going to buy up all or most of the land before rezoning, but I had to check everything out and look for road bumps that might slow down our nefarious and inexcusable plans. So I went alone to look at what was once a town but had been undone by a politician. Most of the structures looked like they were still sound, so it would be worth it to get some experts out to investigate and see if my eyes were speaking truth. One after the next, I saw buildings that could be repurposed and others that would need to be torn down. I made a day out of it, and I knew that I was mostly going to have a very positive report to give to the boss man. He was going to become a millionaire several more times over once he sunk his talons into this deliberately destroyed location. So then I walked into the hotel, or the former hotel. Light was fading. The day was beginning to turn to night, and this was going to be the last place I checked out. I didn't like being in those places once it started getting dark, as the rodents seemed to come out at night, and I'm creeped out by rodents, especially rats. So I was starting to get scared just by walking into the place, looking around on the floor to see what was gonna run across my feet, you know? And as I looked into the lobby in the darkening evening at the marble floor, scanning for scurrying little disease-carrying furballs. I saw it. I saw the Dogman. Now, I have always had side interests, and cryptids were one of them. Nobody I worked with knew I was interested in Bigfoot and Dogman, but I was. And I nearly went into shock when I realized I was looking at a Dogman. I thought it was asleep at first, as it was lying on its belly. The arms were splayed out to the side in a weird fashion, though. Had he fallen face first onto the floor? Was he drunk and passed out? I looked closely, and I could not see the chest moving up and down, so I could not be certain that it was even breathing. Now, if this happened current day, obviously the first thing I would have done was take a picture of it with my phone. But I only had a BlackBerry back then, and those things barely did anything other than texting. They seemed fancy at the time, but they were garbage when you look back on it. I don't even remember if it took photos, but I doubt it could have in that darkness anyway. I walked silently into the room with the Dogman lying on the floor. If that Dogman got up, I was dead meat, but I desperately wanted to understand what I was seeing. Besides my obvious curiosity concerning whether the creature was alive or not, I just wanted to see him. I mean, those of you who are interested in cryptids must understand my situation. I finally had a chance to witness a Dogman, and alive or not, I wanted to witness it. I did not have a flashlight with me, as I had not planned on staying there so late, so I just tiptoed around and squinted into the dark. The creature's face was not facing down to the ground. Instead, the chin was resting on the floor. The arms lay out left and right, and the legs stretched out lifeless and limp behind it. It sure looked like he had just expired and keeled over, but I have no idea what actually happened. I'm not a doctor, and if I were, I'm not sure I would understand Dogman biology anyhow. I'd have to call in the forensic people to figure out what happened. But police were the last individuals I wanted to send out an invitation to under those circumstances. The snout on the creature was long, the longest canine snout I think I'd ever seen. Laying on the floor like that, he reminded me of a hairy alligator. I shuddered all over each time I imagined what that creature must look like when it's alive and kicking. I had begun to accept that it must have ceased living some time ago, but the body did not smell all that bad yet, which confused me. Maybe it was still alive. Maybe it was just unconscious or in a coma. Yet why wasn't I seeing him breathing? I wanted to stay much longer. In fact, I didn't want to leave at all. But I needed to go get some others to help me out. I needed to go see the boss man and ask him what he wanted me to do. And so I did just that. And the boss man decided to send me back with a bunch of armed guys and architects the next morning. The architects could check out some of the buildings I thought might be salvageable, and the armed men and I were going to go through that hotel, extracting any Dogman or Dogman bodies that we happened to come across. I was creeped out at the prospects of returning to that place, but I was happy that I was doing so this time, with protection surrounding me. So we went back, and of course, that Dogman body was no longer on the hotel floor. It was just not there. Neither time I had showed up at this place had there been one single human soul there to greet me, yet somehow, someone had moved that body. Unless it was still alive, and it just got up and walked away. These were tough men that I had brought with me, but everyone was feeling nervous that day. There was an oppressive feeling that we were being watched the entire time, and I think we all expected monsters to jump out at us each time we looked behind any door. Nothing of the kind happened, though. Everything went as smooth as glass, and soon my Dogman report was entirely forgotten. We did find some feces in 2 of the hotel rooms, and I wanted to have it analyzed in a lab, but the boss man just laughed at me. I told him it might belong to an unknown species, and he said, yeah, it belongs to the Homo americanus, a very rare species of homeless bum. So that scat was never analyzed. We might have scooped proof of the Dogman up and slopped it into the garbage. But that's life, I suppose. The area is now a collection of big box stores, and the boss man's children and grandchildren are rich and evil. I never took time to have a family. My life seemed too dangerous for me to want to bring women and children into it. But the one danger I wish I had a chance to face in my youth is the one I never did. I wish I could have come face to face with a Dogman, a living, breathing, awakened Dogman. Even if he did me in, even if he tore me apart, it would be worth it to me to get to see him in action before I depart this world. But my legacy will not be one of success and discovery. My legacy will be one of watching an important discovery slip through my fingers like sand. And that's because I found and lost proof of Dogman. Dogman's scary and leaves people screaming. Then where he goes, everybody wonders. Our executive producer, her last name is Freeman, and her first name is as always Sandra. Please join me in thanking Sandra Freeman for making this episode possible. In exchange for helping this channel survive some dark times, Sandra receives cool perks from us. Hank will be here after the end of this next story to fill in the deets. But now, we've got one story left, so fasten your seatbelt and get ready for Living with Werewolfism, a victim of lycanthropy. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was a young man, I had an argument with my parents, and to spite them, started hanging out with some very bad young people that I knew it would hurt my parents to see me with. I participated in rituals with them that seemed to have been evil in some way, although I do not know what their religious view was really based on. They were unlike any cult I've ever read about since then, yet their practices seemed very ancient. I don't know what they did to me, but after a couple of missing time blackout episodes, I began to understand that I had been somehow changed or altered. It took me some time to fully grasp the meaning of this change, which was that I, myself, had become a sort of part-time Dogman. I'm going to tell you about the living hell of coming to terms with the fact that you transform into a carnivorous predator while you sleep. And I'm going to explain to you how I had to change my life all around just to manage my illness and keep those around me from falling victim to the Dogman that I become. My now elderly parents keep informing me that I am a werewolf and not a Dogman, but I knew about the Dogman long before I understood that werewolves were and are something distinct from that. You'll have to forgive me if I use the two terms interchangeably, and I hope you can follow the intent of what I'm trying to tell you without getting hung up on particular jargon. I don't care what you call me. I've been called some pretty bad things already, and it didn't hurt my bones. So as I said before, there was a missing time episode one night, and the last thing I remembered was hanging out at a diner with that crowd of people. They talked me into coming with them to hang out in the nearby woods, and I do remember that we did get up and leave. But my next memory is waking up in my own bed the next morning. I had been renting a room in a sleazy building in a dangerous neighborhood, which at first it seemed very affordable. The more I hung with that crowd, though, the more I missed work, and suddenly I found myself without a job and with rent coming due. I was about to call the leader of that gang and demand he tell me why I couldn't remember the previous night, but as I rehearsed the words in my mind, I felt a chill all over. If I talked to any of those people, they would steer the conversation in the direction they wanted it to go. I would follow their suggestion, and the next thing you knew, I'd be experiencing even more missing time. No, the answer was not to call them, but to go home to my parents and apologize for being such a spiteful moron. I was so nervous on the train home that I felt like I was going to pass out, but my parents were surprisingly cool about everything. My father said it was better for me to find things out by trying and failing than by being lectured. He said he had no judgments and told me a story about something really dumb he did when he was around my age. Then we both had a big laugh about it. Everything was super corny and sweet, like the happy ending of a Hallmark TV movie, and I went to bed, glad to have the opportunity to reboot my life and try to get off on a better foot this time. I went to bed feeling hopeful. That night, though, I had a horrible nightmare, which changed my entire life. In that dream, I was running around that old neighborhood in Greenwell Springs, which is north of Baton Rouge in Louisiana. I ran through streets, and women screamed in fear at my approach. I raced out in front of cars who beeped their horns loudly at me, hurting my very sensitive ears. Greenwell Springs has a pretty vast forest just to its north, and in my dream, I ran into those seemingly endless woods, running faster than I'd ever run before. Sometimes I ran upright. Other times I ran down on all fours, and I was amazed how little it hurt my hands to run on them, no matter what the surface. In those woods, I did unspeakable things to living things smaller than myself, actions which I cannot describe in the company of strangers, and yet actions which felt perfectly natural to do in that moment. I remember eating and making a mess of myself and my surroundings. I wandered, full and satisfied, to a running stream that I guess must have been either the Amide River or the Sandy Creek. I washed myself, I drank the water, and I walked back onto dry land. As I did so, I noticed my own reflection in a shallow puddle of water on a flat-topped and very darkly colored stone. I could see the full moon behind me, and then I could see my own face. It was not the face of a human being. It was the face of what I would call a dogman, and what my parents would call a werewolf. It was far more like a canine head than a movie werewolf like Lon Chaney Jr. played it. It wasn't like I just had a lot of hair glued to my face. It was like I had the face of a caveman-era canine. My teeth were too long to be those of a modern dog, or even wolf. I was a monster canine, and I was capable of moving around either as a dog down on all fours, or as a man up on my hind legs. I had a thirst for blood, and a hunger for meat, and I understood nothing else but to seek out this food, and then to sleep afterward. I remember waking up before dawn in my bed and thinking that was one hell of a dream, and then falling back asleep. In the morning, I felt awesome. I felt better than I had in recent memory. I didn't only feel good physically, I felt in a better mood than I'd felt since young childhood, before reality started to set in and ruin everything. Speaking of which, my room was a mess, and I didn't have any memories in my head, which would explain why that was so. When I went downstairs for breakfast, one of the neighbors was at the kitchen table telling my parents about how she and her husband saw what she called the American Werewolf in London, crossing Greenwell Springs Road, which is also called Route 64. Do you know where there's that clear cut in the woods so they can put the phone lines through? Well, the neighbor claimed that she saw the American Werewolf in London run right out of that clear cut into the road, where it stopped dead in front of them and turned to stare at them. The lady said her husband slammed on the brakes and turned the wheel to the right to avoid hitting that thing, which appeared to have some kind of something small hanging out of its mouth. I won't speculate on what that might have been. According to this woman, the creature stood up on its hind legs and watched as she and her husband swerved off the road into a ditch. Then the upright walking werewolf hopped over the drainage ditch to the left of the road, as though it were a crack in the sidewalk, and he raced off into the woods between the houses over there. She continued her story to my parents, going on about the tow truck they had to call and so forth. I wasn't listening anymore, though, because I realized everything this woman had been describing had happened in the exact same way in my dream. That American werewolf was me. Only I wasn't in London. I was in Greenwell Springs. Life for the next day or two for me became like something out of a Freddy Krueger movie. I tried to stay awake because I was afraid of what would happen if I fell asleep. I knew this had to do with those people in that cult, but I was even more afraid of contacting them than I was of becoming the wolf again. Well, I tried to stay awake, but it's something that you could only do for so long. I began to feel delirious, and before I knew it, I had passed out in my bed. Neighborhood pets were reported missing the next day. There was property damage. At least I'd gotten a little sleep, and it allowed me to sit down and do some thinking instead of panicking. I needed to accept that this was happening, and then I needed to take steps to mitigate the damage of the American werewolf when he appeared. Once I had the situation somewhat under control, maybe then I could begin to search for a cure. I wasn't going to be able to do this alone, however. I was going to need someone I could trust to help me. I risked telling my father about it, which turned out to be the biggest mistake of my life. Dad instantly had me committed to an institution where I was held for years. It turned out he was angrier at me than he looked. And he could be spiteful in his own right. Plus, getting me declared insane meant he wasn't liable for all the property damage and lost pet situations that I had unwittingly created. And so I entered my mental patient period. I remember little of those years, but I was told after the fact by a fellow inmate I consider fairly sane that I did in fact turn into the werewolf again one night in there. That was how they figured out that I needed different medication than what they had been giving me. The hospital tried some other obnoxious potion on me, and that one cut down my memories of my dreams. It also seemed to de-intensify the dreams themselves somehow, so that I have not ever turned into the werewolf again since. I've been living out on my own, holding down a part-time job, and managing to subsist now for the past 7 years. In all that time, I have never missed my doses of whatever the doctors tell me that I need to take. Life is mostly pretty chill most of the time, but I admit I've grown afraid to stray too far from my home. If I have to go on a trip, I'm nervous that I'll lose my meds or have them stolen from me or some such thing. If I could have nightmares anymore, I suspect they would be about me turning into the werewolf while I was around vulnerable people, such as passengers locked in a train that's hurtling down a track. Or what if I got the conductor and then the entire train went out of control? If I remain at home and telecommute, I can have a portion of my old life back while not endangering others. After all, the last time, pets went missing. I'm very lucky it wasn't humans as well, and this is why I need to keep that wolf submerged in my subconscious. I've never married, as I don't think it's safe for anybody to be in my room while I'm sleeping. I lock myself in at night, just in case something goes wrong. Well, last week, I think that possibly something did. When I woke up that morning, I felt extraordinarily dehydrated. I climbed out of bed, and before I could head to the bathroom for some water, I noticed that some things were knocked off of shelves and onto the carpeted floor. I picked them up and wondered if we had had an earthquake the night before. After rehydrating, I came back into my bedroom and saw that my bed was far more messed up than usual, with the blanket mostly on the floor. It struck me as very odd, so I looked around the room more carefully And I noticed a few other things had been knocked about as well. If I had become the werewolf the night before, at least I hadn't broken anything. None of the blankets were torn or ripped. Maybe I had just gotten up and been sleepwalking around the room or something, but I still think that due to my prior history, this is somewhat concerning. I've moved most of the breakable and valuable objects out of my bedroom, and I'm thinking about installing a much thicker door. To be honest, if the werewolf came back at full force, I don't even know if the walls of this house would withstand him if he freaked out. I can't ever really fully relax, and neither can anyone else who is living with werewolfism, a victim of lycanthropy. If you're thirsty, then have a drinkily.
If you can't use the tub, use the kitchen sinkily.
If you need to solve a problem, then you need to thinkily.
If you need an executive producer, then you need Bondinkily.
Please join us in thanking Bondinkily for making this episode possible.
He gets to share some of our cool perks,
like our weekly secret Sunday stories far too wild
to tell on this channel,
and our over 25 hours of archived secret uncensored episodes.
Now here's international TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman
to fill in any deets I may have left out.
Hank?
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com, and that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.